When the legislature convenes, lawmakers will focus on balancing the state budget. We detail some of the funding sources available in this week's Capitol Report. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this week's Capitol Report. I'm Julie Bartke. The legislative session in Minnesota tends to focus on the budget for the first year and bonding and policy issues the second year. The 2013 session will be a budget year, and we thought we would take this opportunity to inform you about many of the funding mechanisms available, beginning with the financial source that is used for many areas, from education to health care. John Brune details the general fund.
Minnesota's state budget is managed through a wide variety of funds. This combination of state and federal funds could be thought of as separate checkbooks. Within each is an amount of money that, together, provides for the operation of state government. Of all funds, the state general fund is by far the largest and most important.
Minnesota's budget actually consists of about 3 dozen major funds, the largest of which is the general fund. And just as it sounds, the general fund is general. It's flexible. It's the largest, most flexible resource in the state budget, and in the most recently enacted budget, it makes up about 54% of the overall budget.
The general fund stands apart from the others because it is flexible. Lawmakers and the governor have the ability to move dollars to different areas as needs arise.
Economic circumstances change, priorities change, and being able to react and allocate money to meet priorities is an important function of the budgeting process that the legislature and governor engage in. Additionally, the general fund is the predominant focus of the budget debate at the Capitol every 2 years when the biennial budget is enacted. The general fund, different than dedicated resources, needs to be actually actively acted upon. The legislature sets a 2-year appropriation law, and that law needs to be enacted with the signature of the governor every 2 years. So it needs more direct hands-on involvement in the legislature through the appropriations process.
The general fund is considered a non-dedicated fund. Its flexibility allows lawmakers and the governor to use this money for practically any state government need. The other funds that make up the balance of the state operating budget are considered to be dedicated. These include revenue from state and federal sources. Money is essentially deposited into these funds for specific purposes. For instance, the state receives money from the federal government for Medicaid payments or highway construction, while other state dollars are dedicated for things like the Healthcare Access Fund or natural resources.
For the most part, funds outside the general fund have a dedicated purpose. Within that fund, there's typically some flexibility, but it has a more narrow focus. A key difference is dedicated funds often are, by law, set in terms of how's the money going to come in and what may it be used for. The general fund, by contrast, the money essentially goes into a big pot. It's general in its function, and the legislature can allocate it how it sees fit. And it has that discretion and that flexibility, and does so every 2 years in the appropriations process by setting a biennial budget and then modifying it often in the supplemental budget year.
When money comes into the state, it is separately deposited into the appropriate fund. Revenue placed in the general fund comes from numerous sources, but 2 areas in particular make up the bulk of the fund.
The general fund, being the biggest fund in the state budget, has a number of major revenue sources, but actually the 2 largest are the individual income tax and sales tax. Between the 2 make up about 3/4 of the revenue in the general fund. There are a variety of other taxes, a statewide property tax, corporate income tax, that also contribute resources to the general fund. But over a long period of time, about 3/4 of the general fund has come from those 2 revenue sources.
Once money is deposited into the general fund, it is distributed to many areas of the state budget, a majority of which is concentrated in 2 specific areas.
About 3/4 of the state's general fund budget goes to K-12 education and health and human services. So money to school districts and charter schools through the education budget. And health and human services, most of the money in that budget area pays for health care services for individuals who are low income, elderly, or disabled. Beyond that, a wide array of government services, the higher education systems in Minnesota, local units of government. Beyond that, public safety and corrections, environmental programs, transit programs. So it really covers a whole spectrum of what state government funds.
Keep in mind that the general fund is the largest of all funds that make up the state operating budget. It is not a dedicated fund, meaning it can be used for just about any state government need. And on occasion, revenue from other funds may be transferred into the general fund. Because of this flexibility, it is a major focus of the state budget process.
Trying to meet the priorities of the state through this flexible resource is really what a lot of the budget debate at the Capitol is about. The fact that there are many competing priorities is what often makes balancing the general fund difficult, aside from the fact that the major revenue sources in the general fund can be very sensitive to the economy. If the economy does well, general fund revenues tend to do well. If the economy is doing poorly, general fund revenues tend to suffer and create shortfalls in the general fund.
On December 5th, speculation on whether lawmakers will have to address a budget deficit will be announced by Minnesota Management and Budget Commissioner James Showalter. That budget forecast is a snapshot of the financial picture for the state. John Brune explains the process.
The Minnesota state budget runs on a 2-year cycle. The governor proposes a budget, and the legislature reacts to it, discussing and debating appropriations laws. Eventually, they come together to reach a final budget agreement. The state constitution requires Minnesota to have a balanced budget at the end of each fiscal year, which runs from July 1st through June 30th. A balanced budget can be achieved with the assistance of budget forecasts, which help legislators and the governor to monitor revenues and expenditures and make changes as necessary in order to keep the budget in balance.
The budget forecast is an estimate of revenues and expenditures for the entire state budget, and it's prepared by state agency. Minnesota Management and Budget is the state agency responsible for producing the forecast, and it's required by law to be produced once in November and once in February.
While each forecast gives a snapshot of how the state budget is doing, the forecast given in November serves a slightly different purpose than the one given in February.
The November forecast occurs at a time that the fiscal year is underway and some number of months have passed. About 4 or 5 months of data will inform how is the budget doing, and the requirement for the governor to submit a budget to the legislature means that the governor's budget process needs to have updated economic data, updated revenue and expenditure estimates. And so the November forecast really sets the baseline for the governor's budget proposal that often occurs in January when the governor submits the budget to the legislature. In February, the refinement to the November numbers really is a result of additional economic data that occurs at the end of a calendar year. And so between November and February, more data becomes available to forecasters to make hopefully better estimates based on that data.
The budget then takes effect the July 1st following the conclusion of that legislative session, once the appropriations are put in place.
Once a budget is adopted, it's monitored and it's adjusted, and during that time period the budget forecast informs whether or not it's on track. And if it's not, then the legislature in a supplemental budget will make adjustments to revenues and spending to ensure that the budget's balanced. And so that cycle repeats itself every 2 years.
A supplemental budget occurs in the even-numbered year of a legislative session, once a 2-year budget has been enacted.
And this is an enhancement to what we did in 2011 to provide...
The legislature and governor have the opportunity to modify it, and it may be modifying it in order to bring a budget back into balance. It may be modifying it to meet changing priorities. But the supplemental budget is taking the 2-year budget that has already been enacted and making modifications to it, and that will be the focus of an even-number legislative session.
The The budget forecast that Minnesota Management and Budget produces starts with a set of economic data that's produced by a national macroeconomic consulting firm known as Global Insight.
Global Insight provides data on the U.S. economy, data like unemployment, wages, gross domestic product. These are important economic variables that factor into estimating revenues in particular, but some of the spending lines too are also influenced by the economy. And if you think about it, a lot of the things that are important in the Minnesota budget, things like income tax, sales tax, are things that are sensitive to economic activity. And so knowing what's happening with the economy is important to estimating what will those major revenue sources do. Will they grow? Will they shrink? Heavily influenced by the economy. Economists at Minnesota Management and Budget use national economic data and use it to shape a Minnesota-specific forecast, a forecast for Minnesota's economy based on how Minnesota fits within the national economy. And so the forecast will look at Minnesota wages, Minnesota unemployment, and use national economic data as a backdrop to producing Minnesota-specific information. Just like a weather forecast that we watch on the nightly news tries to tell us what the weather is going to be like in coming days, a budget forecast tries to tell us what the budget's going to look like in the upcoming period. It's forward-looking. It tries to inform us of will the budget be in balance, will it be a surplus, will it be a deficit. And just like a weather forecast often doesn't turn out to be exactly right, the forecast doesn't turn out to be exactly right either, but it's an attempt to have an accurate picture of revenues and expenditures for governor and legislature to make funding decisions.
Budget forecasting is a constantly evolving process designed to assess a state's fiscal health at specific times during the year. While it's not a perfect process, it does give lawmakers and the governor the opportunity to plan for a better future.
You may have heard a great deal about delayed school payments, money owed to Minnesota schools by the state. Well, those payments are just one part of a complex funding formula for Minnesota's education system.
Minnesota has a long history of commitment to education. The state constitution serves as the guiding force of each elected legislature, past and present, to fund an ever-changing system. Education funding is a complicated mix of federal, state, and local government dollars, often based on various formulas targeting the social, economic, and geographic backgrounds of students. This video is designed to provide a very basic overview of how education is funded in Minnesota and the role that each area of government plays in the distribution of tax dollars to school districts. Education funding in Minnesota comes from three sources: federal, state, and local government. The federal government portion makes up the smallest amount of the education pie, about 9% for fiscal year 2012-2013. Typically, a block of money is sent to the state from Washington to be used for specific purposes.
In most cases, the federal dollars get passed directly through the State Department of Education directly to school districts to pay for things like special education, community services, aid to school districts, operational costs of school districts for kids that are that come from impoverished environments. Those are pretty typical federal expenditures.
The state government portion of the education pie makes up the largest slice, about 68%.
Those are the dollars that we appropriate, as they are dollars that are the result of general taxation in the state of Minnesota. And those are the main dollars that fund the school system. Education is unique in that most of the dollars that we spend at the state level is funded directly out of the general fund. Education is the largest single portion of the general fund. It's about 40% of overall general fund expenditures. So most of what funds our state school system comes from general taxation, the sales tax, the income tax. All of those resources flow directly into the state school system.
As well as being the biggest, state government funding is also the most complex piece of the pie. Money is distributed from the state general fund to school districts based on numerous education formulas, which are designed to create a more equal or fair way of funding education.
At its basic core, a formula is a mathematical calculation without bias of generating dollars for school districts and charter schools and all schools throughout the state. So in other words, let's count the kids and multiply them times a number that we have agreed in law is how much we should give for each kid. And that's a way of allocating dollars without bias. If you didn't have formulas, you would have, then the education system would run the risk of being prone to favor among legislators. Who happens to be in power today, who happens to be in power tomorrow, and let's bias the money in one place versus the other. A formula has a way of creating a little bit of distance between the decision maker and where the dollars ultimately go. A number of legislators have talked about the notion of let's just take all the money that we have allocated to education and count all the kids and divide up the money. That's one view of what we talk a lot about in education, which is fairness. Fairness being every kid gets the same amount of dollars. But other legislators, and there's always competing interests in the legislative environment, will turn around and say, wait a second, every kid doesn't cost the same as another kid. Poverty is a factor, the ability to speak English is a factor, the distance matters. In some school districts in northern Minnesota, the distances are great and there are high costs for what we consider to be sparse school districts. All of these factors and many others tend to dictate why we need to have a variety of different formulas to deal with these differing costs. And these different formulas will reward some districts more than others. So because of these different views of fairness and the state constitution that requires us to have a fair system for every child in the state, we have different formulas to deal with those effects.
Local government funding makes up about 23% of the education pie. It consists of local levies or property taxes.
The second largest pot is the local levy, and the state does have a say in those. Ultimately, the school boards of each district has to approve the local levies, but in some cases we have formulas that are a blend of both state aid and local levy. The state aid portion is directly decided by the legislature in St. Paul. The local levies, the legislature does approve local levy authority, but ultimately it's the local school district that has to make a decision about whether to impose taxes on the property in the district.
Not all school districts have the same resources, so in some cases, local funding is enhanced with additional state dollars. One district may require more state assistance while another may need none at all. Understanding the scope of education funding is difficult to do all at once, so remember to begin with the basics. Funding comes from federal, state, and local governments. The federal government sends money to the state in one block or lump sum payment. It's then distributed directly to school districts for any number of specific purposes. Federal funds make up the smallest portion of education funding. State government is where the bulk of funding for education comes from. It's comprised of income, sales, and other tax revenue from the state general fund and is dispersed to school districts through a number of complicated formulas. The formulas are based on social, economic, and geographic variables and are designed to produce a more uniform way of funding education. Local government includes property taxes or levies decided on by school districts and local communities. Sometimes additional state dollars are blended with local levies to help particular districts around the state.
When it comes to funding the environment, there is a myriad of special funds, fees, and other financial resources available. Here's a breakdown of Minnesota's environment and natural resources funding process.
Natural resources play a major role in Minnesota's identity as a state. Lakes, rivers, and streams are an abundant source of activity for thousands of people each year. Forests, prairies, and parks also provide lasting recreation and enjoyment. These and other resources can also be natural habitats for many species, all of which must be protected. Minnesota must balance habitat and recreation to preserve this environment for future generations. To do this, the state provides two primary funding sources: user fees and two constitutional amendments, the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund and the Legacy Amendment. Each time you purchase a hunting or fishing license, for example, the money is used to help fund specific areas related to natural resources. Other fees collected help to fund other specified areas.
We have a number of user fees that will fund most of, at least our major environment and natural resources agencies. Some of the minor ones have a lot more general fund, but the major ones are all funded primarily through user fees, game and fish license fees, snowmobile registration, watercraft licensing, the DNR, and the Pollution Control Agency. You've got the fees for permits. We do have a fee on motor vehicle transfers where the money goes in there. That's a little bit more of a general one. Then also there's a tax on garbage that goes to the Pollution Control Agency. So those are primarily our major fee-driven agencies, our Department of Natural Resources and Pollution Control Agency.
The money generated by these fees is collected by the state and deposited into specific accounts.
Every 2 years, the legislature appropriates the money from those accounts. It acts just like it's appropriated similar to a general fund appropriation, only we specify which account it's coming out of. Like the Game and Fish Fund, all the fees for game and fish licenses are put into the one fund, and that fund is then appropriated for those activities, for the basic activities that the department does to regulate and to administer the game and fish laws in the state.
Voters approved an amendment to the state constitution in 1988 to help protect and enhance Minnesota's outdoors. The Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund is designed to supply long-term, consistent financial support for various aspects of the state's abundant natural resources.
Well, the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund was set up to kind of broaden our environment and natural resources, including increasing habitat, but it also has much broader implications. The state has funded a number of environmental education programs out of that, a number of studies that lead to improvements of the environment and natural resources in the state. It can be used for basically all environment and natural resources projects. It includes research, environmental education, things like that.
The Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund consists of state lottery proceeds and investment earnings. By law, the fund's balance cannot be spent. Only a percentage of the balance may be used each year on environment-related projects. It's the job of the Legislative Citizens Commission on Minnesota Resources, the LCCMR, to decide where that percentage of lottery proceeds should be spent.
What happens is 40% of the net proceeds, after all payments are made, after all prizes are awarded, and all costs are subtracted, 40% of the net proceeds gets deposited into the trust fund. That's been building since 1989, and it's about $600 million today. And then what happens is, under the Constitution, 5.5% per year can be spent can be appropriated by law by the legislature. So currently, the LCCMR, or Legislative Citizen Commission on Minnesota Resources, has the duty to make a recommendation to the legislature on how to spend that money. That will be a list of what they've determined to be the highest priority projects to fund, and the legislature can do as they will with it. Sometimes they've made changes, sometimes they haven't. But they will take those recommendations and then appropriate money from the trust fund as allowed under the Constitution, and then appropriate for specific projects. And there are a number of, sometimes they've had hundreds of projects that have come forward.
Once the LCCMR concludes its work, the legislature decides on the recommendations and begins work on legislation to appropriate funds to the proper agencies.
In 2008, the legislature passed another constitutional amendment to pass on to the voters to vote on that. That's the Legacy Amendment. What that does is provides an additional sales tax of 3/8 of 1% on the general sales tax, and that money then is divided up. 33% of that goes for the Outdoor Heritage Fund for habitat projects. 33% goes to the Clean Water Fund for clean water projects. 19.75% goes into the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund for arts and cultural heritage projects, which are not necessarily outdoor projects, but it is part of the legacy amendment. And then 14.25% goes toward the Park and Trail Fund, and that's used for basically to support parks and trails of a statewide or regional significance in the state. So that's important because a couple of factors. The first part with the Outdoor Heritage Fund, that's to try to get our habitat back to some level, a higher level that it's been. It's not to do the day-to-day DNR projects that are paid for the Game and Fish Fund or other funds, but to try to restore and increase habitat for wildlife in the state. Where in the Clean Water Fund, that's to try to restore some of our lakes, rivers, and waters, and other waterways in the state. It's mostly to comply with federal requirements under the Clean Water Act. We have a lot of lakes, rivers, and streams in the state, and many of those are impaired. And under the Clean Waters Act, we have to recognize where those impairments are and have a plan to correct the impairment. And that's a major ordeal to comply with the Clean Water Act. And so that money is to help the state go down that road. The arts and cultural heritage, as the name implies, it's basically to improve arts and cultural heritage in the state. And then the Parks and Trails money, that's for support of our parks and trails in the state. Those have statewide and regional significance, is the way the Constitution reads. I think the key here is that we fund most of environment and natural resources through fees, the fee base, and that pays for the basic on-the-ground services. It doesn't pay necessarily for a lot of improvement to those activities, whereas with the two constitutional funds, the two constitutional amendments, they help to pay for some of the some of the improvements that need to be made and getting beyond kind of the day-to-day activities.
Enjoying the outdoors is a time-honored tradition in Minnesota. Consistent efforts to maintain and protect the state's environment and its natural inhabitants are critical to all future generations.
It's now easier to stay in touch with activity at the state capitol. Senate Media Services is on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. Find the links on our homepage. So follow us and follow the Senate. We hope you've gained some insight on the complex formulas that fund many of Minnesota's programs and services. That concludes this week's program. From all of us at Senate Media Services, I'm Julie Bartke. Thank you for watching.